The next talk we're going to have is the second of our lightning talks. Unfortunately, our guest speaker, Michael Schellenberger, was unable to be here. He got stuck in Illinois, but one of his colleagues is here with us. Cesar Penafiel is here. He's the director of analytics at Environmental Progress. If you haven't heard of Environmental Progress, they're a new environmental research and policy organization that's working on reversing the decline of clean energy around the world. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask Cesar to come on up here. All right. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. So yes, Michael is stuck in Illinois testifying there in the Congress trying to save the nuclear fleet. I guess that is more important perhaps than being here. So Environmental Progress is an organization that was founded by environmentalists, scientists, conservationists concerned about the decline in clean energy globally. Few people know that clean energy has actually declined from about 37% of the share in 1995 to about 32% in 2014. We have been focusing on looking at the reasons for this. We've talked to utilities in 5 different countries in the world. We are in 4 different states. We are talking to all kinds of stakeholders. And we are realizing that there is no shortage of policy solutions. The shortage is political will. And the number one reason is that just people don't like nuclear. It is the second most unpopular form of electricity generation after coal. How could that be? We know that nuclear is safer than anything else. We know that it's carbon-free. As Senator Booker said, people don't know that. He didn't know that. People don't know that nuclear represents 60% of the clean electricity generation in the country. So I gave you the bad news. Nuclear has declined, clean energy has declined 5% over the last about 20 years, even though solar and wind has grown 3.7%. Basically went from nothing in 1993 to about 3.7% in 2014. But nuclear has declined in the last 8 years, even in absolute terms. It has declined 10%. Globally, we are tracking 121 gigawatt capacity at risk of closure by 2030. The U.S. has already lost 4 nuclear plants, as Secretary Moniz said. In relative terms, is perhaps not a lot. The U.S. has a lot of nuclear power, but it represents 80% of the solar generated in 2015. The equivalent of taking those nukes and replacing them with gas, as certainly has, is the equivalent of putting 3.1 million cars on the road. And now we are looking at possibly 13 plants closing in the next 2 years. That is 3 times the amount of solar generation in 2015. That is the equivalent of putting 11.5 million vehicles on the road, assuming that it's all going to be replaced with gas, and some of it might be replaced with coal. The mitigation cost of carbon is $40 billion. And by 2030, we might be looking at half of the U.S. nuclear generation getting closed prematurely. That would essentially wipe out 44% of the EPA's clean power plan targets, or the equivalent of putting 37 million vehicles on the road. So let's look at some of the states that we're studying. Diablo Canyon, the last remaining nuclear power plant in California, produces 11 times more electricity than the largest solar farm in the United States, that is Solar Star. If you close down I'm sorry, I'm from New York, so Indian Point is close to my heart, but Diablo Canyon represents 21% of the electricity in California. California would become 70% dependent on natural gas if this happens. That would be the equivalent of placing another 1.3 million vehicles on the road in California. In Illinois, as I think it was the Secretary of Energy said, 90% of the clean electricity comes from nuclear power. Replacing just Quad Cities and Clinton, the 2 plants that are possibly going to close in the next year or 2, would wipe out the clean power plant reduction targets by 1/3. Those 2 plants would decrease the clean energy electricity generation in the state by 23%. And how much would it cost to keep these plants open? Today there was a report in the newspaper, and even if you take those numbers, which seem a little high to me, the surcharge would amount to 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Compare that to the 21.9 cents if you take these, EIA numbers of subsidies to solar, or the PTC. It's a small fraction of the cost. In New York, the closure of Fitzpatrick, which we think is going to happen, and the governor wants to shut down Indian Point, would set back the state by 9 million metric tons a year. That is 3 times more than the EPA's Clean Power Plan reduction targets for New York. How much would it cost to subsidize Fitzpatrick? About $9 a megawatt hour. Compare that to New York's renewable subsidies of 24.6. It's a small fraction. So obviously, why is this happening? It's because nuclear is excluded, is discriminated in all the federal subsidies. The amount of subsidies that solar gets, 140 times the amount of subsidies, and this is just at the federal level. And wind, wind gets about 20 times, 15 times more. We have about 30 states that have mandated renewable portfolio standards. Nuclear is not included, so an obvious solution would be to include nuclear in a clean energy portfolio standard. And there's just, as I said, there's no shortage of policy solutions. One thing that perhaps states should be considering is buying back these nuclear power plants. I was in Albany 2 days ago, and in the CES hearing, they brought up the possibility that utilities might be allowed to own large-scale renewable generation if a market failure can be demonstrated. Well, I think we're looking at a market failure. We perhaps should consider that. And the same thing with capacity markets. They need to start valuing more some of the attributes of nuclear power, and we've gone through that. So my time is up. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, Cesar at environmentalprogress.org. Thank you.